We're happy to have Pierre-Louis Vézina. He's going to present his paper on migrant networks and trade using evidence from Vietnamese.
Hi.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation. So, as you said, today I'm going to talk about the role of migrant networks in international trade and give you evidence from a natural experiment. So why do we care about the pro-trade effect of immigrants? So recent research in international trade has identified information frictions as being one important obstacle in making gains from trade happen. Migrants, they have contacts in their home countries, they have knowledge about how the markets work, knowledge of how the institutions work, and they can lower such information frictions. In that way, migrants help countries realize gains from trade, and this has implications for immigration policy. There's a large literature on this topic. The most famous paper studies the role of Chinese networks in international trade. And the main result is that countries that host larger Chinese communities trade more with each other, because Chinese networks know about trade opportunities. A recent literature review has identified 45 papers that has looked at this effect. The average effect is that a 10% increase in immigration is associated with a 1.5% increase in trade between the two countries.
But what is the causality here?
Yeah.
Exactly. This is where I come in. But reservation persists as to the potential of other unobserved phenomena stimulating both trade and migration. This is from a literature review from 2005 by Robert Lucas. Another reservation comes from Gordon Hansen. It's difficult to draw causal inference from these results. Immigration may be correlated with unobserved factors that also affect trade, such as the cultural similarity or bilateral economic policies that stimulate both trade and migration. Hence, identifying causality from migration to trade has yet to be conclusively established. This is from a recent literature review. So what we do in this paper is we're going to bring cogent causal evidence from a natural experiment. So what is our natural experiment? It's a unique episode in human history. The exodus of the Vietnamese boat people, mostly to the US in 1975. So this episode, it combines a large influx of migrants to the US. At the same time, you have a quasi-experimental distribution of these migrants across US states. And concurrently, you have a trade embargo. So the US doesn't allow trade with Vietnam. So this is an ideal natural experiment to identify the causal impact of migration on international trade. So this picture gives you an idea of what we're trying to estimate. So we're going to look at the impact of the migration shocks, which is given by the dashed blue line in this graph, on the trade exports from US to Vietnam, which is given by the red line. So it's the impact of this migration on this trade. We're going to use, so you see that the migration from Vietnam to the US from 1970 to 2000 on this graph consists of three major waves. We're going to use only the first wave, so after the fall of Saigon in 1975, to identify the distribution of Vietnamese across states. Rest of the talk standard. I'm first going to describe the natural experiment in more details. Then I'm going to talk about the data and the results and go a little bit deeper into the mechanism after that. Okay, the natural experiment. In 1975, the south of Vietnam, where Saigon is located, falls to communist North Vietnam. The US gets out of Vietnam. People in South Vietnam are afraid of being sent to re-education camps, agricultural collectives, so there's hundreds of thousands of refugees flee South Vietnam. Some of them embark on small boats. They go towards shipping lanes. They go towards neighboring countries, refugee camps, and this is where the name boat people comes from. the U.S., which was highly involved in the Vietnam War, decided to take an active role in this refugee situation. So it decided to bring a first wave of 130,000 refugees in 1975 to the U.S. Organized a huge boat lift, uses the U.S. military to take people from Thailand, but also from Vietnam, but also from refugee camps in Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. And this is how they use helicopters, their boats, everything. Bring them first to a restaging area in Guam, and then flies them to the U.S. There, voluntary agencies take over, and the refugees are split across 4 refugee camps in California, Arkansas, Florida, and Pennsylvania. And there, from these camps, within 6 months, 130,000 refugees are resettled throughout the U.S. This is the example of one of these camps. This one is the Camp Pendleton in California. And this figure shows you the weekly releases from these 4 camps to U.S. cities and towns. So you see from May to December 1975, you had on average about 4,000 refugees that entered U.S. society. It was a huge migration shock. Before this wave of refugees in 1975, there were fewer than 1,000 Vietnamese-born people living in the U.S. So in the really short period of time, huge Vietnamese shock to the U.S. We have the location. This is the example of the camp in Arkansas, which was called the New Horizon, and here you can see the progress of resettlement of the refugees. So already about 35,000 have been resettled, and about 12,000 to go. So it gives them new hope into resettling into U.S. society. So we have the location of these refugees on 31st December 1975, which is the last day of the closure of the last camp. They were split out throughout the U.S. This is where they all went. One person here is 500 refugees. So we're going to argue.
Happens all the time, don't it?
So this distribution is quasi-experimental for 3 main reasons. The first one is that the U.S. government had a dispersion policy. So wanted to spread the refugees across the U.S. as much as possible. I'm going to come back to this in the next slide. The second reason is that there's a trade embargo at the same time. So the refugees cannot go to the states that are already trading with Vietnam. And the third reason is that we observed a certain level of secondary migration after the initial resettlement. So the Vietnamese decided to move to other states. And this reveals that their first destination is exogenous to their own preferences. So first, the dispersion policy. So the U.S. government wanted to avoid the kind of geographic concentration that happened with the Cuban refugees 10 years before. They all went to Miami. And this was difficult, somehow supposed to be difficult for U.S. society to absorb such a huge labor market shock, and for them to not have that much of a culture shock also on U.S. society. So an effort was made by the U.S. government to distribute the refugee population throughout the U.S. Another studies in 1995 puts it this way. The goal of resettlement through the reception centers was to disperse refugees to avoid another Miami.
It's funny what you're saying then, because they're saying that the Cuban refugee wave was unsuccessful. And just now it's given as example of the most successful, actually.
True.
immigration
Yeah.
ventures of the United States.
True.
So sometimes
Maybe
along
10
the
years
line,
after
you
it
change,
happened,
yeah.
they weren't sure it was going to be that much of a success, but it seemed that it wasn't that much of an impact on labor markets in the end. But they still wanted to do things differently in 1975. And so the voluntary agencies working under U.S. government contracts, they oversaw the resettlement, and in most cases, decided their destinations. This gave rise to Vietnamese communities in cities that didn't even have Asian migrants back then. Examples are New Orleans, Oklahoma City, Kansas City, etc. So these graphs show you the number of refugees that the states got in 1975, whether it's correlated with economic variables of the state, to see if there's something driving the allocation of refugees to certain states. So the first one shows you the relationship with GDP per capita in 1975. There's no statistical relationship. There's no statistical relationship with with the migrant share of the population in 1975. There's no relationship with how remote the state is from U.S. export ports. And there's a slight negative relationship with the level of unemployment. So states that had higher unemployment got fewer refugees, but it's not driving the results that I'm going to show you. Yeah.
Remoteness from what exactly?
The?
Remoteness from what exactly?
So for U.S. export ports.
So New Jersey is really remote, you know, and Washington is really remote, or
No, it's the other way around. This is the most remote.
But you know, so there is a
Alaska
Maryland
and
there,
Hawaii.
and there is New Jersey on the other side. How exactly Maryland and New Jersey are that far from each other?
Which state? New Jersey?
Maryland and New Jersey.
Maine and
You would want them to have the same level of remoteness?
I
Or?
think it's Maine.
But you know, ME is.
So it's not just geography, it's also where
In a
the...
way, it's like on the Atlantic. But
Yeah, it's on the Atlantic.
They're both on the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, so how they can be remote?
Is there a single port in Maine?
But you know, DC is on that side. There's a kind of one is the most connected.
Well, this is a standard measure of remoteness in international trade.
And then Nevada is where New Jersey, you know, something is really funny about it.
West Virginia is neutral.
So you can think of many economic variables at the state level that are it's not driving the allocation of refugees across states.
But if you do it, you know, price of housing. Price of housing, potentially. You know,
Lots of housing, we could do that. I mean, there's a series of other variables that we could try. My impression is that it's really allocated to every state. At the same time, you have a trade embargo. So this is under the Trade with the Enemy Act. The U.S. didn't allow U.S. companies to do business with Vietnam. So this really takes care of the reverse causality here, that the refugees could not have been allocated to states already trading with Vietnam. And 20 years after, in 1994, at the end of 1994, Bill Clinton decides to lift the embargo. The third reason why we argue that the distribution of refugees across U.S. states is quasi-experimental is that we observe large flows of secondary migration after 1975. The reason why you had this secondary migration is that some extended families were broken up by the process of resettlement, and a lot of them wanted to get back together, reunite with their kin, their friends, go to California that had a better welfare system, a better climate. And from one study, we know that 45% of the refugees of whom we know residents were in a different state in 1980 than they were resettled to in 1975. So this high level of secondary migration, more or less high level of secondary migration, suggests that the initial placement was exogenous to the migrants' preferences in a lot of cases. So we're going to use this exogenous allocation of Vietnamese refugees in 1975 to instrument for the Vietnamese communities in 1995, which is the first full year where trade with Vietnam was allowed. And this identification strategy is similar to two previous studies that haven't looked at the impact on trade, but have looked at the impact of ethnic clusters on wages, at the impact of ethnic diversity on preferences for redistribution. But both these studies use the allocation of refugees across Sweden municipalities to also identify the impact of immigration on labor market outcomes. So there is some prior studies that come up with a similar identification strategy, but not in this breadth of literature. So this graph shows you how strong our instrument is. Horizontal axis is how many refugees the state got in 1975, and vertical axis is how many Vietnamese migrants live in that state in 1995. So it's strongly correlated. So despite the fact that you had secondary migration, you have a high level of persistence. Just because you're sent to Arkansas or to New Orleans in the first place gives rise to Vietnamese communities there. Our baseline regression is very simple. So on the left-hand side, we're going to have U.S. exports to Vietnam by state. And we're going to take the yearly average from the period for which we have data, which is between 1995 and 2010. We're going to regress that on the stock of Vietnamese migrants in 1995 and add a bunch of control variables. We're going to normalize exports on the left-hand side. So we're going to divide exports to Vietnam as a share of the state's total exports to control for size effects. The three control variables that we include, the first one is the state's income per capita. So the reason why we include this control is that rich states are have been shown to be more likely to export more differentiated products, and it might be that they're also exporting more to Vietnam. The second control is a measure of export structure similarity to what Vietnam imports from the US. So we want to control for the fact that some states might already produce what Vietnam is likely to import. So you want to control for this export structure. And finally, a third control is a measure of trade costs. So it's easier to export from California or from New York to Vietnam than it is from Arkansas. So you want to measure how remote the state is from the US export ports.
And the distribution across these four centers were just random? Yeah. So Camp Pendleton in California and Arkansas both had, together they had 75% of all the refugees. But what we know is that the location of the refugees is not determined by the camp by which they were processed. So if you were processed with Camp Pendleton in California, you're not more likely to be resettled in California. So the data sources, do you have a question?
Yeah, just minor comment. It might be easy to export from Arkansas to Vietnam than from New York. But that's, it just means Mississippi River. It's still there. So we have to be careful.
What is that?
Mississippi River. So it might be easy to export from Arkansas.
Okay.
So it's just an example of, Wyoming, it's, it would be...
Okay. That's interesting. So our main data contribution here is the location of the refugees in 1975. And we found this in the 1976 report by the U.S. General Accounting Office. The migration data and the trade data and other U.S. state-level data are from standard sources. This map gives you the distribution of the Vietnamese migrants in 1995. So the shades of gray and the diagonal lines give you the distribution by states. So you can see that the three main states with Vietnamese populations are Washington, California, and Texas. And you have a bunch of cities in California with large Vietnamese communities, but you also have some in some places where you wouldn't necessarily expect them to be. So New Orleans and Houston's are the most famous examples, but also like Minneapolis, where with the freezing weather you wouldn't expect the Vietnamese to have farm communities there, but just because a lot of refugees were sent there in the first place, you still have a big Vietnamese community there in 1995 and today as well. Alright, so this table gives you the benchmark results. Column 1 is the first stage. So it shows that the refugees in 1975 that the state got is highly correlated with how many Vietnamese are in that state in 1975. So we passed the weak instrument and the weak instrument test. Columns 2, 3, and 4 gives you the second stage. So does the Vietnamese size of the Vietnamese community in 1995 explain? In column 2, how much the state exports to Vietnam as a share of its total exports. Column 3 is how much it exports to Vietnam as a share of its GDP. And column 4 is a measure of the extensive margin of trade. So how many industries does the state exports to Vietnam among all the possible industries? So for these three measures of trade intensity with Vietnam, we find a positive and significant impact. This is what the coefficients mean. If the migrant network is twice as large, the share of total exports going to Vietnam increases by 14%. And the average share of...
I probably missed it when you spoke about this. How do you measure, well, it's number of migrants, Vietnamese migrants, or share of migrants?
So in this benchmark, in this baseline regression, is the stock of migrants, total number of Vietnamese.
Before.
Yeah.
Not the share of population.
Hmm?
Not the share of population.
Not in the
Share of
benchmark.
migrants. State.
We do a robustness check with the share of the population, and I'll show you in the next slide. So the average share of exports to Vietnam is very low at 0.1%, so that gives you an idea of how important Vietnam is as an export market for the US. If we think about what's the impact on the state's exports to Vietnam as a share of its GDP, well, that goes up by 19%. And the share of categories exported to Vietnam increases by 27%. The robustness checks. So the first one is, instead of doing total number of Vietnamese, we take Vietnamese as a share of the state's population. What we can also do is take Vietnamese as a share of the migrants living in that state. And to be even more precise, take only the Asians. We can also run a reduced form regression where we just look at the impact of the refugees in 1975, whereas they have a direct impact on exports. That works as well. And the last robustness check here is to look at, on the left-hand side, instead of looking at exports to Vietnam as a share of the state's total export, we take exports to Vietnam as a share of its exports to other Asian countries, to all Asian countries. So you have something even more precisely identified in this case. So for all these robustness, we get similar results for the three specifications. We also,
What would normally be goods that the US would export to Vietnam?
what goods?
Yeah.
I'll show you a table also in a few slides.
So
The main...
understanding distribution by states.
So we have export data in 28 product categories at the state level. And number 1 in terms of value is transport equipment. And number 2 is food and beverages.
So Vietnamese import food from the US, is that what you're saying?
Oh yeah, they import shrimp from the US. Go figure.
This was a Galveston community around this. That's what they did there.
Go ahead.
Do you know by any chance how many Vietnam consulates are in the United States? How many Vietnam consulates are within the United States and where are they located?
So we haven't looked at consulate. We've tried to look at associations and things like that. Yeah,
And
then
which
we did find a bunch,
associations
like
would-
maybe a handful.
What associations?
It's mostly California. It's mostly California. So another robustness check that we do is exclude California. So run the regressions on 49, on 50 states plus Washington, and 49 states plus Washington. And so the results still hold even if you exclude California. Another robustness check that we do is estimate falsification test. So instead of taking the state's exports to Vietnam as a share of its total exports, we look at, does it help the state exports to other Asian countries? The Vietnamese, if they really build linkages with their home country, it shouldn't help trade with other countries. So here you have it for 10 Asian countries: Thailand, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, etc. We find no significant impact for 8 out of 10 countries, and we find a significant impact for China and for Cambodia. So this is not too worrying, because 8 out of 10 is a good average, but mostly because the trade effect with China can be explained by the fact that a high proportion of the Vietnamese refugees to the US, especially the second wave in 1979, were actually ethnic Chinese Vietnamese. When North Vietnam engaged in a conflict with China in 1978, the Vietnamese North became really aggressive towards this Chinese population, and that stirred this wave of ethnic Chinese to the US. And the impact with Cambodia can also be explained with a similar story, is the fact that a lot of Vietnamese people actually live in Cambodia and are highly involved in business in that country. So this can explain these two coefficients in column 1 and 2. But overall, these placebos are supportive of our hypothesis that Vietnamese help trade with Vietnam. This is a table of the main exports to Vietnam. So I rank them here according to their share of US export. So to know in which goods is Vietnam a more important market for the US. But you can see the total value in this column, and you see that the highest is for transportation equipment. So these are in $1,000, so this is 3 billion, the yearly average export. The second most is food and kindred products. But if you look at in which product is Vietnam an important market, it's leather and allied products and forestry products, wood products. So what can we learn from these types of goods that are exported to Vietnam in terms of the migrant effect? Well, what has been done in the literature so far is to classify these goods into differentiated products and goods like chemicals and wood products that have reference prices and that are sold in organized exchanges where less information is necessary to know about which products to buy to make trade happen. So this is known as the Roush classifications. So you have differentiated goods, reference price goods, and organized exchange goods. And in this case, we get the standard results that the migrant impact operates mostly via differentiated goods, which are more information intensive. So to further quantify,
Can I ask a question? So therefore, the assumption is that the people who came from Vietnam, they didn't have any skills specific to those industries, so everything is basically in random. So the people in Galveston, sorry, I come with this example, they didn't know how to fish, but they became, well, so there is really no connection between their skills of this large number of people and the industries they were engaged in.
So the first wave of refugees, no, there's probably no relationship because they were highly educated people, and they probably started in much lower, low skills activities than what they were able to do at the time. But the further immigration waves that came, a lot of them were fishermen, and they became fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico. So there is some matching in terms of occupations in further ways, but I don't think that is creating any it doesn't impact. The first wave is our identification strategy. So if the migrant from Vietnam decides to go to the Gulf of Mexico because this is where he can become a fisherman, it's not driving the fact that shrimp industries will start exporting to Vietnam. So a further quantification exercise is to look at case studies. So we're going to look at the top 10 US states in terms of how many refugees they hosted. And for each of these top 10 states, we're going to build a synthetic counterfactual. So what is going to be the synthetic counterfactual? It's going to be a weighted average of other US states. And we're going to select among US states that had at least 5 times fewer refugees. But we're going to weight these states to minimize the differences in export shares across industries. So we want to have a counterfactual, a weighted average of other states that is very similar in terms of what it exports, but is very different in terms of how many Vietnamese it hosted in 1975. So this figure gives you the example of California. So the vertical axis gives you exports to Vietnam as a share of state GDP. The blue line is the data. And the dashed line is the synthetic counterfactual. So what would have happened if California had received 5 times fewer refugees? So you see that there's a huge difference. The same is true for Texas, for Minnesota, Virginia, New York, state of Washington. And on average, if we take these differences, in the top 10 US states, exports to Vietnam as a share of GDP would have been 3.2 times lower if the number of refugees would have been 5 times lower. Okay, let's go a little bit deeper into the mechanism. So why do migrants, Vietnamese migrants, actually help exports to Vietnam? Well, one reason is that they keep ties with their homeland. And one way to measure that is to see how much interest there is into the Vietnamese Facebook, which is Zing.vn. So we can measure how much interest there is in that website across US states using the Google search index. And you see that the Vietnamese share of the population is highly correlated with how much interest there is in the homeland. But what's interesting here is also the deviations from the fitted line. So why does the state of Hawaii have a large number of Vietnamese, but they don't seem to be really interested in what's going on in Vietnam? So if you want to make trade happen, do you need to have a lot of Vietnamese, or do you also need for them to keep ties with their homeland? So what we do is we interact the two variables. See if the effect of the Vietnamese migrant operates through ties with the homeland. So on the vertical axis here, we have the impact of the Vietnamese network. And on the horizontal axis, you have the index of how much ties there is with the homeland. So you see that there's a positive and significant interaction between the two variables. So the effect increases significantly with how much ties there is with the homeland. So this gives an indication that one of the reasons why they make trade happen is because they have interest in this Vietnamese Facebook.
Why is it that way as opposed to the other way?
Sorry?
Maybe they are interested in making trade happen, and that's why they keep track of what's going on in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And aside of that, what is that indication of the wealth?
Huh?
Of wealth?
The wealth?
Yeah. That, you know, those Vietnamese that went to different states,
Yeah.
they eventually, you know, maybe they will match somehow on skills, or who remains there were, you know, somehow matched with skills, so the states will reach some opportunities where, you know, they integrated and get richer in some states.
Yeah.
You know, what if that just captures some variation? I mean, there's no dispute in the coefficients that the kind of the Vietnamese population matters for trade,
Okay.
but whether their social activities matter
So
for
you're saying
trade.
the Zing index is correlated with GDP per capita?
For instance,
So GDP per capita is controlled foreign regression, so that's not what's driving this correlation, but there might still be something else that's correlated.
for
There's a
instance,
possibility that Zing.vn index captures something else. I don't disagree with you. You would have to try many things and see if the interaction is positive as well.
but do you have any data on type of skills, the type of industries that these Vietnamese people entered? Or at least in terms of communities they entered, whether it was cities, small towns, whether it was villages, that type of thing.
So we just know the state where they went to, in terms of the 1975 refugees, and that's our identifying variation. So we cannot go at the county level to identify the impact. But we do have some measures of occupation. The standard results in the literature is that if it's the higher skilled migrants have more of a trade impact. We're not convinced this is the case, and there's also some occupations may help trade in many unexpected ways, like maybe some Vietnamese work in a car factory. Maybe Vietnamese don't work in a car factory, but the car factory hires a Vietnamese consultancy firm to help them export to Vietnam. And then you wouldn't have a direct matching between the exports and the occupation of the Vietnamese. So it's not necessarily the right way to identify the effect. This is definitely not the most, it's a suggestive evidence that ties with the homeland actually matter. I'm not going to stop here, so I'm going to continue to dig a little bit deeper into the mechanism. So one way in which it can help is that you're going to help a U.S. multinational export to Vietnam. Why is it complicated? Especially at the end of the 1990s, it was complicated to do business with Vietnam. You needed licenses for everything. For example, an eye care product company in the U.S., you needed to be registered with the Vietnamese Ministry of Health. You need Vietnamese contacts to do that. The first person you're going to reach to is the Vietnamese community in the U.S. Another example is that the Vietnamese themselves, which have a higher rate of entrepreneurship than the U.S. population as a whole, they create their own export businesses, and the first destinations they have in mind is Vietnam. One example here is the sriracha sauce, which was founded by David Tran, who is himself a boat people. He got to the U.S. in 1979, and he gave his company the name of the boat that took him to the U.S. This company in 2010 had sales of 60 million. 80% of this is in Asia. Well, this is one of the mechanisms by which the Vietnamese networks help trade with Vietnam. And another one we can think of is consultancy services or information businesses. The first long-distance telephone lines that were set up after trade was liberalized were by Vietnamese businesses in the U.S. The first company was called Pan-Pacific Telecommunication Management. The first travel agency that organized flights between the two countries was also by a Vietnamese entrepreneur. It's called Travel World. And there's also ethnic innovation. So we know that migrants in the U.S. are really active into innovation by U.S. firms. For example, the first company that came up with the use of Vietnamese on computers was founded by a Vietnamese migrant. So such software and companies obviously grease the wheel of commerce between the two countries and are made possible only thanks to the Vietnamese community in the U.S. So one way to look a bit at the numbers here, we don't have U.S. firm level data, but what we know from the survey of business owners is how many businesses per state have a Vietnamese owner. And what we find is that the states that got more refugees have more Vietnamese businesses in 2007. If the refugee stock doubles, the share of Vietnamese businesses goes up by about 50%. Another mechanism is that in 2008, the Vietnamese, at the beginning, after the embargo was lifted, Vietnam was really skeptical about doing business with its overseas community. The reason is that it didn't want them to take over control of the economy of the country. But second half of the 2000s, they seem to have changed their mind about the role that this overseas community should play, and came up with trade policies, investment policies, a government action plan to try to attract them as much as possible. Give them nationality if they want it, give them preferential rent, loans, a reduction in corporate income tax, and also lower tariff on machinery import. So maybe these preferences to their overseas communities are one of the channels by which migrants actually help promote businesses with Vietnam, so exports from the US to Vietnam. So what we can look at is what happened around this government action plan, which happened in 2008. So what happened from 2006 to 2010 in terms of export growth to the US, and see if it was higher in states that have a higher Vietnamese community. Well, this is what we do. So the horizontal axis here is how many Vietnamese live in the state in 1995, and the vertical axis is the increase in US exports to Vietnam around 2008, so 2006 to 2010. So you can see that the increase is also positively and significantly correlated with how many refugees are in the state. So it seems there is an interaction between the migrant network and the government action plan, or something that happened in 2008. All right, 210, it goes until 240. Yeah? So we're going to have plenty of time for discussion. I'm just going to give you a little bit of bonus material. We can also look at the import side. The reason why I didn't focus on export in the main part of the paper is because you want to get rid of the migrant preferences for goods from their home country. So this is not considered a network effect, but it's considered a demand effect. So you can get rid of it by looking only at export. But it's still interesting to look at the impact on import, because it's a huge deal for Vietnam to be able to export to the US. It has huge development implications. Particularly in 2001, US and Vietnam signed a free trade agreement that wasn't really important for the US in terms of gaining access to Vietnam, but was really important for Vietnam in terms of getting access to the US. This is the average tariff that Vietnamese firms face in the US. You see that in 2009, it goes down from about the applied tariff, which is the green solid line, goes down from about 40% to about 7.5%. So huge deal for Vietnam. The problem also with imports is that we don't have a state level measure of imports. What we have them is by US ports. So we can do some kind of imperfect matching between the Vietnamese communities and the imports, but that leaves us with only 30 observations. Nonetheless, we find a positive and significant impact in 4 out of 6 specifications. We don't find it as a share of GDP, but that may be driven by the low number of observations. So this impact on imports can also be thought as nostalgia trade. So they import products that they miss from their homeland. And we can think of, maybe for further research, think of these imports as a gain from variety for US consumers. And one example of this nostalgia trade is entirely Vietnamese malls in the US, where you have the supermarket, the nail salon, the travel agency. They're all from Vietnamese business owners. And this is an example in Virginia. And along the US flag, you have the South Vietnamese flag that's still flying. And this is no longer the flag of Vietnam, but it seems that the Vietnamese that moved there in the 70s and 80s still keep ties with the old nostalgia trade, if you want. Okay, so just the conclusions left. What we do in this paper, we establish a causal effect from migration to trade using the Vietnamese boat people as a natural experiment. It also has implication in terms of what are the long-term economic consequences of hosting refugees. And what we also want to do is bring back attention to the role of immigration policy in lowering trade frictions and helping realize gains from trade. That's it. Yeah.
So there's this idea that a lot of exporting firms start off with domestic production, and then like the stars of the market like start exporting. And my concern here is that with this trade embargo, a lot of these exporting firms could have been started producing domestically, and this could have been influenced by the local demand, of course. And so then what you're picking up is not really a network effect, but this.
For the export side, you mean?
Yeah.
US export to Vietnam?
Yeah.
Because they sell goods locally to the Vietnamese population before the embargo's
Yeah,
over.
yeah, exactly.
Or because they developed exactly those. So you ruled out this import thing. So at your bonus slides, you said that following up imports, you'll be catching something else, so you'll be catching tastes and preferences. But then you give examples of goods that are exported from the US to Vietnam, such as software and this sauce, which I dare not pronounce the name of. But these two are, again, not about network, it's about that they knew what to produce, right? So,
okay, so they're producing goods that are sold only for Vietnam.
not only, but
Is that what you have in mind?
mainly. It's not only, but with significant
Okay.
focus on eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when I think of this technology innovation, I think more of like greasing the wheel of communication costs between the two countries. And to look across goods, if I think of transportation equipment, is this something that the U.S. really exports to all countries?
Right.
And so if there's an effect of the networks in that category, it's probably something more than just a differentiated product that are aimed only at Vietnam.
Could be just the example that you gave are not particularly convincing in that there is this. So the examples you gave show rather the effect of tastes, preferences, or expertise in producing stuff that would help on Vietnamese market as opposed to network.
Yeah.
Evidence on differentiated goods gives some suggestive evidence in that direction, I guess, right?
Suggested evidence?
The evidence you showed on differentiated goods goes in that
Yeah.
direction. Well, at least in the literature, this is the stance of the people.
But these could also be harder products that are harder to get in the U.S. in the first place.
Yeah, could be.
Well, even in that case, it would mean that it diversifies the production of U.S. Export, of the U.S., which is also a welfare effect that we could add, which is not a trade network effect, but is a
Yeah, sure. I had another question about the external validity. Here we're dealing with refugees, and we're dealing with a situation with trade embargo, or probably lots of profit opportunities that were unexploited just because the U.S. is such a big exporter.
Yeah. So there's already a huge literature on this, and this is kind of like a small contribution, but so there's a trade-off, right? You either go for the macro regressions and you show that there's an impact as a whole, or you go with a natural experiment case study and shows that there's clear causal evidence. So here what we bring to the literature is this precise case study for Vietnam. So of course, this cannot mean that any refugee population will bring the same benefit. I don't want to claim this, but say that in some cases there's a clear causal evidence from immigration to trade.
But even looking at refugees, can think about refugees in terms of just other types of migrants. Do you have a sense of
Yeah, so there's a paper that does that also. So try to see
do refugees have the same trade impact as migrants in general? And what they find is that refugees don't have the same trade impact. It's done with the U.S. also, so that
But is it like
maybe
a
also
lower bound or upper bound? Or, I mean, what is your sense of that?
I think if you take high-skilled migrants in the U.S., it's strongly positively correlated with export. If you take refugees, it's not robustly correlated with. I don't know the exact number, but it's not a robust relationship between refugee flows and trade flows.
You know, to complete your story, I'm thinking of the other natural experiment about to happen. It's Cuba. So, well, even though the distribution is almost, what's that?
About to happen?
About to happen, yeah. That's what I'm saying, yeah.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. I can tell you even when, but anyway, yeah.
You in a bit?
Sorry about a bit, yeah. Yeah, but it's almost, of course, drug distribution, as everything is in Miami. But the question is really, can we learn, can this lesson be applied to Cuba when it happens?
Yeah, when they lift the embargo.
Then we let them power. No, but you see, that's a little different story. There is really, the concentration is different. It's only one port, and I'm just wondering whether it's.
I mean, there's less variation across states. It's harder to identify the impact, but.
And there's also the issue of the relationship between the Cubans in Miami and the Cubans in Cuba Libre.
What's different? What's different between the Vietnamese?
Yeah.
That
That's
there
the
were
same story.
No, there was 10 years of at least 10 years of appeasing the animosity. There was a.
Some parallels might be drawn, but if we speculate about Cuba, there is big businesses. Donald Trump going to be coming in. There's just different landscape. Perhaps it's very closer to the United States, and then to the.
So we say it's close. So
business. No, as a business, this just purely U.S. demand-driven business going to be kind of working for Cuba. Well, here in this case, it's probably it's networked communities, the Vietnamese people on both sides to be involved.
Actually, will happen. The same will happen there.
It will happen, but it's going to be, if you like, contaminated by U.S.-driven demand.
So your main results using this cross-section of states, you don't control for the unemployment in 1975?
We do a robustness check,
Okay.
but that doesn't drive the results.
Okay.
But this recent wave that you mentioned for 2008, I think, do you have kind of the change in policy in Vietnam for the kind of preferential treatment of imported businesses, essentially? And I wonder if you have more data on that, or what kind of data collected around US, whether one can actually see how Vietnamese people were involved into it.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely what we plan to do in the future, so go deeper into this preferentials.
Yeah, because that might highlight the specific mechanisms, whether this is entrepreneur-driven business things, so it's actually entrepreneurs, Vietnamese owners of the firm, so that actually drives this process. Or if you like, intermediate people, like translators and stuff that are crucial for the process. So it's like, they're not the ones who have ideas, but they are really instrumental into facilitating that stuff.
Yeah.
Would be nice to see if one can separate these two things.
Thanks. Good one. Other questions?